Friends and comrades, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on which time zone you are joining us from. Thank you so much for being here with us today. My name is Karina Mullen, and I am a member of the U.S. Peace Council Secretariat, and I will be hosting this discussion today. I would like to welcome everyone to our webinar today entitled No War on Iran, Building an Anti-Imperialist Resistance. We're very fortunate to have two outstanding speakers with us today who are not only rigorous intellectuals on the questions that we will be grappling with in today's webinar, but also who are on the front lines of organizing to build this anti-imperialist resistance that we'll be talking about. So we gather at a moment of escalating Zionist imperialist aggression against the Islamic Republic of Iran. While the Zionist imperialist genocide continues under the guise of a so-called ceasefire in Gaza and Trump's, so-called board of peace, alongside over 100 years of settler colonial violence and dispossession of the Palestinian people, and the manufactured instability across West Asia. From an anti-imperialist perspective, we know the aggression against Iran from the August 12-day Zionist imperialist assault and Iran's resistance to it, to Mossad, CIA covert actions and attempts to destabilize the country through a failed color revolution, to threats of further military intervention and intensified ideological warfare. We know all of this has nothing to do with claims about human rights or democracy. It's about disciplining a state that refuses submissions to the diktats of U.S. empire, that disrupts polarized accumulation on a world scale, and therefore challenges the ability of the U.S. ruling class to continue draining global South wealth at the scale to which it has been accustomed for centuries. Sanctions, hybrid warfare, covert destabilization, and military encirclement are structural tools of U.S. empire. If we are serious about peace, and this is the U.S. Peace Council hosting today's event, we must be serious about dismantling the U.S.-dominated capitalist imperialist system that blocks meaningful peace from emerging. And Iran's role, as the speakers today will cover, must be understood within this global context. Iran has built and sustained relationships with Latin American governments under siege, strengthening diplomatic and economic ties with countries like Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, and others as part of a broader effort to build new channels and infrastructure of South-South cooperation. It has contributed to developing alternative financial and economic architecture, as well as strategic and military cooperation beyond U.S.-controlled institutions, helping to open space for global majority countries to pursue greater sovereignty, delink from the imperialist core, and move towards a truly polycentric world order. Iran has consistently provided diplomatic and material support for Palestinian liberation, situating itself within a wider anti-colonial and anti-imperialist axis. These are the reasons we know that Iran is being targeted. And of course, we cannot forget, and this is, of course, part of the U.S. Peace Council's framing and understanding of U.S. imperialism, that the war abroad is connected to, it's inseparable from the war at home. And the U.S. Peace Council's position is that this same system that imposes sanctions and funds military expansion deprives our communities here in the belly of the beast of healthcare, housing, education, and infrastructure, while normalizing fascist repression, targeting especially immigrant, working class, indigenous, Black and brown communities at home. So opposing war on Iran is not a single issue demand. It's about rejecting the entire political economy on which permanent war at home and abroad are built. So we're honored today to be joined by our two amazing speakers who I'm going to introduce right now. We have with us Nina Farnia, who is a legal historian who writes and teaches about modern U.S. imperialism through a world historical lens. Specifically, her research and scholarship are focused on the legal and diplomatic mechanisms that uphold U.S. imperialism throughout the world. As a specialist in West Asian history and an Iranian woman, She is especially interested in the role that law and diplomacy can play in advancing anti-imperialist resistance. Her first book, Imperialism and Resistance, is forthcoming with Stanford University Press in 2026 and is based on her doctoral dissertation, Imperialism in the Making of U.S. Law, 1940 to 2008, which won the Julian Mezzi Dissertation Award from the Association for the Study of Law, Culture, and the Humanities in 2023. And we can't wait for that book to come out. She is a co-founder of the Anti-Imperialist Scholars Collective, a co-founder of the International People's Tribunal on U.S. imperialism, sanctions, blockades, and economic coercive measures, and the chairperson of the Law and Humanities section of the Association of American Law Schools. Prior to law school, she worked as a community organizer in Chicago for the Southwest Youth Collaborative and the Arab American Action Network. Our second speaker is Ajamu Baraka, a member who is also a member of the U.S. Peace Council Secretariat, a geopolitical analyst, organizer, writer, human rights defender, and veteran of the U.S. Black Liberation Movement, with over 53 years of work in the U.S. and internationally. Baraka is the founder of the Black Alliance for Peace and currently serves as the director of BAP's North-South Project for People-Centered Human Rights. Recently, Baraka co-founded the International Coalition to Stop Genocide in Gaza to support the South African case filed with the International Court of Justice. In 2016, Baraka was a candidate for vice president of the U.S. on the Green Party ticket. He currently serves on the executive committee of the U.S. Peace Council, as well as the Secretariat and the leadership body of the United National Anti-War Coalition, UNAC. He's an editor and contributing columnist for the Black Agenda Report and the recipient of the Serena Sherm Award for Uncompromised Integrity in Journalism. In 2019, Baraka was awarded the U.S. Peace Memorial's Peace Prize. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from you both and to our discussion today. Nina, the floor is yours.
Thank you all very much for the invitation. I'm excited to be here with you, and I'm especially excited for the discussion. So I'll begin by talking about sort of how we got to the moment that we're in. I'll spend a few minutes discussing, how to think about the Iranian Revolution, the Islamic Republic, especially for people located in the West. And then I'll end with a bit about where things are going, or where I think things are going and what's happening, what will happen moving forward. So as as everybody recalls, I think quite vividly, I want to start with Al-Aqsa flood on October 7th, because I think that's the moment that really changed the trajectory of the world that we are in for the better. Al-Aqsa flood transformed the region, and largely as a result of the strength and ingenuity of the Palestinian resistance, specifically in Gaza. For the first time in decades, we're now decisively in an era where Israel is on the defensive. And Israel, as the primary outpost of U.S. imperialism in the region, is no longer as strong as it used to be. This process began with Hezbollah's victories in the 2000s, but it's accelerated since Al-Aqsa flood. And basically, since that period, the region has been in protracted war. Right? The region has been in protracted war for decades, but that war is accelerated now. And during war, each side takes hits. One major loss for our team was the loss of Syria. It was a significant loss. Obviously, the assassinations of Hezbollah leadership, the assassinations of Iranian leadership during the 12-day war, etc. So that's sort of the broad context. Then what we have now was the 12-day war in Iran, Iran was prepared for an invasion, but at that time, because they were in nuclear negotiations and they hadn't been at war, at direct war, combat in decades, they weren't prepared the night that they got struck in June. But within a day, they were ready to launch against Israel and to really engage. That war, by and large, appears to have been a decisive win for Iran. And the Israelis and the Americans like to say that they won because they set back Iran's nuclear program. But even American officials came out, I think the day after the US hit the nuclear reactors, and said that it looks like little to no damage was done, and Iran has not been decisively weakened. So fast forward to the events of December, right, where the Iranian currency takes a significant hit over the course of a few days, of something like 30 to 40% of its value disappears. We come to find out some days after that, during Davos, that Scott Bessent, the U.S. Treasury Secretary, said as much, that they were engaged in economic statecraft to hurt the economy, the Iranian economy, and then sort of create the conditions for dissent in the streets and protests in the streets. They pulled dollars off of the market, and that's what precipitated the crash of the currency. So in the beginning, there were legitimate protests by different forces, different sectors within the Iranian public. Those protests were met with discussion and negotiation by the state. I think they came to some resolutions, and then shortly afterward, basically an urban warfare began in the streets. And at the same time, Pompeo, Trump's former Secretary of State and head of the Mossad, head of the CIA during the first administration, actually said Happy New Year to our men on the streets of Tehran. Israeli news outlets said, we are involved in and funding and supporting this operation in Tehran. So we knew for a fact that the forces of empire were involved in this urban warfare campaign. We also saw videos that indicate that this was not your average protest, right? There was one video in particular that was especially distressing. A man was being dismembered with an axe in the street while a group of people completely masked and wearing all black were watching. This is not any kind of behavior that we typically see in Iranian protests. In fact, this is the kind of behavior that we only see in ISIS and Mossad-involved political activity. There was a video that went viral of a masjid that was set on fire, was bombed. It turned out that there was a mother and a child, a mother and a daughter in that masjid. 3 teenage boys or young men ran in to get them out. And then the masjid was set on fire. And I think those boys, I don't think they survived, or a couple of them at least didn't survive. And for me, growing up in the United States, this actually reminded me of the bombing of the church during the civil rights movement and the 4 little girls who got killed. So this was a very significant and aggressive campaign of urban warfare. If you talk to people that sort of went through it in Iran, they will tell you they've never, ever witnessed anything like this before or experienced anything like this before. A lot of people were actually deeply traumatized by it. People who lived through the revolution, lived through the Iran-Iraq war, they said this was far worse than anything they'd ever seen. What was sort of remarkable about what happened is that Iran disabled Starlink, which has historically been used in regime change operations around the world. This is the first time it was decisively disabled. And that basically allowed Iran to defeat the the urban warfare campaign, to win in the campaign. So we'll talk about sort of what this means for imperialism, I think, in Q&A, and I think Ajamu is going to talk about that. So I'm going to spend some time talking about the Islamic Republic and the Iranian Revolution. So Iran, since the Islamic Republic, I'm now pivoting, has developed a 5-year plan every 5 years for social and human development. Now, this is, I'm sure many of you have heard of 5-year plans. China infamously has many 5-year plans. And this is one way in which the wealth that is produced through its nationalization of its own resources following the revolution is redistributed to the public. It's redistributed to the public through social welfare programs. And the indicators, the human development indicators, are incredible. If you go to the UN Human Development Index, or if you go to I think it's UN FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization, you'll see the results. I mean, this is UN data, not even Iranian data. Literacy went up from something like 40 or 50% prior to the revolution to now it's in the mid to high 90s. Especially for women. The literacy rate among women was incredibly low prior to the revolution. Women are the majority of the university population. Women are the majority of the STEM population, science, technology, engineering, and math. Local medicine production skyrocketed from 25% to 96 or 97%. Agricultural self-sufficiency has risen to 80% since the revolution. That's remarkable. That's like really incredible. Iran is the 12th largest producer of wheat in the world and top 10 among other major food items. And in terms of the UN Development Index, Iran is around 79.8 or 80 or something like that. And that is a figure that is comparable to the figure in Cuba. So is Iran socialist? No, it's not. But is it a capitalist economy? It is not a capitalist economy either. It is a nationalist economy where the wealth from its nationalized resources is redistributed to the people through social welfare programs. And Iran, of course, like all besieged nations, because Iran is under one of the worst sanctions regimes in modern history, like all besieged nations, the Iranian economy struggles. And even the Iranians will say that. They will say that. They call them economic shortcomings. That's the language that the politicians used over the last few months. But Iran prioritizes supporting its people. And this is something that is important for us, especially in the West, to remember, that despite the ebbs and flows of the economic challenges or the various problems that emerge at any given moment as a result of sanctions or anything else, that the Iranian economy is a nationalist economy that since the revolution has been designed to benefit the nation. I want to pivot now to, and I should add, I actually should add that what Karina talked about in terms of the support of the Palestinian resistance is actually enshrined in the Islamic Republic's constitution, because that constitution has a clause that says that Iran is mandated to support oppressed peoples throughout the world. Which resulted in, for example, Iran completely breaking off relations with South Africa, with the apartheid regime of South Africa immediately after the revolution, and with supporting the Palestinian struggle, not just with cheerleading, right, but actual financial support for the Palestinian liberation struggle, irrespective of political faction. So now Iran has in its annual budget every year a line item of funding that goes to the Palestinian resistance. No other nation in the world has that. No other nation. So this is another aspect of the revolution that's really significant. Internationalism is actually embedded in the Iranian state. It's actually embedded in there. So now I'm going to pivot quickly, because I think I only have a couple minutes left, to the what comes next. So, the US and Iran have re-engaged in indirect negotiations. They're still in the process of negotiating about negotiations, and there's significant debate about like the value of this and all that stuff, which I'm happy to discuss. I have a very specific analysis of negotiations and diplomacy, and I'm happy to discuss that during Q&A. But I do think what's important for us to know is that it's likely that Iran is going to get struck again. I think there's one carrier strike group, American carrier strike group, that's in the region already. Another one appears to be on its way as of yesterday or the day before. And for Israel, this has become an existential matter, right? Because Iran proved following the 12-day war that it can basically destroy Israel in a matter of a few weeks or a few months with its missile capacity and the inability of the American air defenses to block Iranian missiles. So, and another layer of this is that Israel is basically now a U.S. military garrison or U.S. military base in the region. It is the U.S.'s most important proxy in the world. It's located at the juncture of 3 major continents, multiple important waterways. And so the U.S. is going to do what it needs to do to defend Israel. Regardless of whatever it says in the media and all that, it's going to do what it needs to do to defend Israel. So we need to be prepared as an internationalist U.S.-based left to defend Iranian sovereignty, because it's going to be our money that's used to strike, our wealth that's used to strike Iran over there. And that is the most important thing that we need to remember now. The war on the region, the broad war on the region that began decades ago, is likely going to pick up. We don't know when, and we don't know how, we don't know who's going to hit first, but it's likely that we're going to see another or a few other major battles. And as part of that, it's likely that the Palestinian resistance and the Lebanese resistance and the Yemeni resistance and the Iraqi resistance are really going to pick up as well. So we also need to be prepared to support the axis of resistance as it decisively ends US imperialism in West Asia. I'll stop there and then we can discuss more.
Excellent.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nina. And thank you for providing really that important historical and geopolitical context and analysis, and also helping us to think through some of the strategic considerations and what the anti-imperialist left should be doing moving forward. So thank you for that. We'll move to our next speaker, Ajamu Baraka.
Thank you so much, and I really appreciate this opening presentation that provides the foundation for my brief comments that will be focused on, in a broad sense, what must be done at this historical moment. But before I proceed, let me thank the U.S. Peace Council for providing this opportunity for this very important conversation. We need to raise up, shout out to our president, Comrade Bachman Azib, and all of the members of this august formation that's been in place for many years and part of the broader World Peace Council that has a decades-long history of anti-imperialist work. So it's an honor to be able to participate in this conversation. So let me jump right into this conversation, and so we can get to the point we can have the interaction with the public. The title of my presentation is basically what I think has to be the task, the anti-imperialist imperative, which is to confront globalized fascism. And I say basically that Friends, we are living through a decisive historical rupture. This is not a moment of policy disagreement. It is not a moment of partisan confusion among anti-imperialists or even simply a crisis of democracy. We are in the midst of a deepening capitalist crisis so profound that capital has abandoned even the performance of its commitment to liberal Enlightenment values. The institutions it created, the United Nations system, the so-called rules-based international order, the human rights regime, have all been stripped of their moral veneer. What remains, my friends, is naked power. The doctrine now is simple: full spectrum dominance by any means necessary. And when empire adopts that posture, clarity becomes a revolutionary obligation. It is imperative, especially for those of us operating within the imperial core, that we understand something fundamental. At moments like this, positions that appear nuanced, balanced, moderate, positions that seek compromise with reaction, that dilute the anti-imperialism in the name of complexity, are not neutral. They objectively amplify the forces of reaction. They legitimize structures of domination. They align, whether consciously or not, with Western and US imperialism. Intentions do not negate political effect, my friends. In periods of fascist consolidation, confusion is not accidental, it is produced. As one left formation in Iran and operates also in this diaspora has correctly stated, at this stage of Western imperialist domination, the global contradiction between labor and capital is embodied in the contradiction between the masses of the world and imperialism. The main axis of struggle today is the defense of nations and peoples against imperialism's political, economic, and military domination. That does not erase secondary contradictions, but determining which contradiction is primary, which contradiction must define the agenda of struggle, is a matter of political life and death. This requires dialectical clarity. It requires the ability to analyze the totality and not trapped in fragments, because imperialism thrives on fragmentation. It tells the oppressed, you can achieve social justice within the framework of imperialist domination. You can secure democratic freedoms while remaining subordinate to empire. You can fight for human rights without confronting the global system that negates them. And perhaps more dangerously, it tells us that struggle can remain purely national, that what happens domestically is separable from the global architecture of domination. This is ideological confusion. This ideological mystification. The domestic and the global are fused. Let's take a look at the United States, for example. What we are witnessing is not random authoritarianism. There's a logic to this. It is the maturation of a coherent architecture of repression, a national security state that fuses intelligence agencies, militarized policing, surveillance systems, and ideological discipline into a single mechanism of control. This system is not reactive, it is proactive. It does not wait for crisis, it anticipates crisis. It prepares for it. It disciplines populations in advance of rupture. This is not about safety. It's about managing dissent. It's about stabilizing the imperial order in a moment when consent is no longer sufficient. Because a system built on exploitation, extraction, and endless expansion cannot govern through consent when its contradictions sharpen. It must govern through coercion. Consider immigration enforcement we see in the US. the ICE raids in cities, mass arrests, workplace sweeps, collaboration between federal agents and local police. This is not merely about deportation, it's about terror, it's about deterrence, it's about instilling fear so pervasive that communities retreat into silence. Migrant communities become laboratories of repression, spaces where techniques are tested, where methods of fragmentation are refined. And once perfected, these techniques do not remain confused or confined. They are generalized, expanded, normalized. Now consider the training relationship between the U.S. police forces and Israeli security forces. This is not by accident. It's not symbolic. Israeli policing is shaped by occupation, by counterinsurgency, by the management of a population defined as a permanent threat. It is not designed to serve a public, it is designed to dominate an enemy. When U.S. police import these methods, they import more than the tactics. They import a political logic, a logic that declares certain populations are not citizens. They are risk. They are problems. They are enemies to be contained. This is the fusion of foreign and domestic repression. The techniques used to occupy abroad are now fully integrated into governance in the United States of America. Sanctions logic become economic discipline. Counterinsurgency logic becomes urban policing. Military doctrine becomes domestic policing. The empire has come home to the U.S., not because it prefers to, but because it must. And this is where we must understand. We are not facing isolated authoritarian tendencies. We're confronting the consolidation of global fascism, a system in which international gangsterism is normalized, state terror is justified, genocide is rationalized, sanctions are weaponized starvation, and all of it is framed as defense of democracy. When barbarism becomes normalized at the global level, it returns inward. It reshapes domestic terrains. It produces a Hobbian international order where the most powerful impose medieval forms of domination to preserve their interests. And once that normalization is complete, the descent accelerates. Beyond the US, we have to connect the other elements of repression, of international repression, of international globalized fascism. Let's take a look beyond Iran, look at what is happening with Venezuela, with that process under the gun of US intervention and state violence. Look at what is being planned for Cuba and executed against Cuba, an international siege, using the techniques that we saw deployed against Palestinians in Gaza. Now those techniques are being deployed against an entire nation with the objective to destroy the Cuban revolutionary process. We have continued occupation in Haiti, and we have the continuation of the colonization of Puerto Rico. These systems are interconnected. This is part of the global fascism, but the globalized war against all of us. So what is the task before us, my friends? It is not reform within the globalized architecture of repression. It is not pleading with multilateral institutions that have already revealed their impotence or complicity. It is not technocratic adjustment. The task is confrontation, political confrontation, ideological confrontation, organizational confrontation, because only organized resistance can disrupt a system that has abandoned pretense. Anti-imperialism is not an option at this historical moment. It is not one tendency among many. It is the central organizing principle of this conjuncture. To misidentify the primary contradiction is to disarm the masses. To equivocate in the face of imperial consolidation is to assist its stabilization. We must say clearly there can be no authentic struggle for human rights that does not confront imperial domination. There can be no democratic renewal that leaves the imperial war machine intact. There could be no social justice inside a global order structured by extraction and control. The choice before us is stark. Either we align our analysis with the realities of global power, or we retreat into comforting illusions. History will not reward ambiguity. It will not excuse hesitation. The imperative is clear. Confront imperialism. Expose the unity of global and domestic repression. Build movements that understand that the fight for national liberation, the fight against sanctions and militarization, the fight against racialized policing and migrant terror are not separate fights. They are one struggle. And only by confronting the totality can we begin to dismantle it. And for this programmatic imperative, my friends, at this particular historical moment, we therefore must be very clear. We must say we will struggle until we win. And with that commitment, we say all power to the people and no compromise and no retreat.
Thank you so much for that, Ajamu. All power to the people. Great words to end on. And thank you really for giving us this really an anatomy of the material connections between the war at home and the war abroad, and helping us and for reminding us of the importance of that of a historical materialist, dialectical analysis, and centering the primary contradiction of U.S. imperialism. And that brings us really to my first question. And I just explained to the audience that we're going to have a little bit of a moderated discussion right now for the next 15 minutes or so. And I see already questions have been coming in the Q&A. The last half an hour will be open Q&A. So if you haven't contributed a question yet, please feel free to do so. But this just will give us a chance to respond to some of the points that have been raised. And then both Ajamu and Nina, if you want to ask each other questions, this is a good time to do that too. So I wanted to start based on some of the points you've raised, Ajamu, both of you, and Nina as well, about the ideological confusion and mystification, as you put it. So I wanted us to think about the role of, let's talk a little bit, more depth about the role of ideological warfare here, because it's been so powerful in terms of shaping not just how the mainstream, and the bourgeois press represents, and bourgeois academia represents what's happening in Iran and the region more broadly, but even, of course, we know among the left. And one of the tropes that comes up a lot is the whole sort of people versus the regime trope, quote unquote, that people can stand with the state without can stand with the people rather without standing with the state. But of course, the state itself is a it's it is, as Nina was saying, it organizes the resources of the state, and it redistributes those resources and the surplus to the masses, and it's a representation of the people, and especially under siege, it's how the people's will gets sort of organized and defended. So how do we address that trope? Specifically, but also more generally, the broader issues of ideological confusion. And I'm thinking here especially about what Gabriel Rockhill terms, the compatible left, how, that are structurally absorbable into the ideological apparatus of empire. What would it take to really overcome those ideological impediments to building a serious anti-imperialist resistance in the US? Who would like to begin?
Well, I could briefly begin by saying that basically that process of confronting the ideological mystifications that drive certain left forces in the West to objectively align themselves with imperialism has to be confronted simultaneously with the building of mass resistance organizations. In other words, this process of confronting the ideological confusion, of engaging in this war of position, if you will, has to develop simultaneously with developing the material forces to, at some point, actually overthrow the material reality of imperialist oppression and exploitation. But we have to engage this because what we are seeing with the pseudo-sophisticated positions taken by elements in the U.S. and in the West, in which when a nation finds itself in the crosshairs of U.S. Destabilization, U.S. aggression, that instead of the response from the left forces in the West being to focus on the imperialist aggression, instead we engage in these torturous conversations regarding the internal structures of these nations to find themselves in the crosshairs of imperialism. In other words, we engage in this process to determine arrogantly whether or not these nations deserve the solidarity from left forces in the West. This is profoundly backward and reactionary. It is arrogant, and it manifests itself as the continuation of white supremacy and Eurocentrism. That basically we all know that the revolutionary imperative has moved to the global South decades ago. There's no question about that. But it appears that Western-oriented leftists don't seem to have understood that. And even some leftists who find themselves in the global South, they still have a Eurocentric Western orientation, not able to even understand the objective and subjective realities of their own societies. So we have to engage this because it objectively disarms mobilization. It allows for the enemy to isolate states and movements because if you are suspicious of the particular state that finds itself under in the crosshairs of U.S. Imperialism, then it's very likely you're not going to mobilize yourself to come out in opposition. You know, you're going to you're going to amplify the criticisms from your left friends, but basically those criticisms will be legitimized by the enemy, even though you're trying to be nuanced, but they will be legitimized by the enemy and used as a weapon of demobilization. So it has to be confronted. The arrogance of the West has to be dealt with, and we can't play with this any longer, especially because of this, of the crucial nature of this historical moment.
Thank you for that, Ajamu. Yeah, Nina, would you like to address it? And also, as someone who's been, targeted for your position, maybe can also talk about, what we've discussed in a sort of Iran. People talk about the Palestine exception within academia, thinking about it now in terms of the Iran exception. Maybe also bring in academia as well here as a terrain of ideological struggle.
I wholeheartedly agree with what Ajamu said about the arrogance and the impulse to try to make decisions on behalf of or for peoples around the world that their states are not worthy for whatever reason. And I want to sort of, I guess, I mean, I've been so frustrated. I'm just going to be frank. I've been so frustrated. We've all been frustrated for decades, right? Following the fall of Libya and Iraq, when Aristide was abducted, what happened to Haiti after that? What we're witnessing now in Sudan. I mean, we have been witnessing state after state after state fall at the hands of US imperialism, and then the people, the nations suffer enormously, enormously when their states fall. And yet we are still having these discussions. We are still having these discussions about how the people are different than the state. And, setting aside everything that I just said about the Islamic Republic and the advances that it's made, et cetera, I've reached a state, and I'm interested in what other people think about this, where I now think that if in the face of everything that we've witnessed in Haiti, in Sudan, in Libya, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, all of it, in Syria, we are still saying all this about how the state and the people are different, and two things can be true at once, and the state's got to go. I doubt, I question the motives of the people that are saying that. I fundamentally question the motives of the people that are saying those things. Now, there is a difference, right? There is a difference between quote unquote experts and opinion leaders that take these positions, and our friends that we see every day, like our friends who are teachers and postal workers, and who hear these things from the US media, from those so-called experts and opinion leaders. And we have to understand the difference. We have to understand the difference. But I fundamentally now have reached a place where I question the motives of many of my colleagues who are so-called opinion leaders and are spouting this BS. And for me, it's deeply personal, because my people, I have family there. I have family in Iran. I have my husband's Palestinian, so I have family in Palestine. It's deeply, deeply personal. We're literally talking about whole families disappearing from records. The records being burned and annihilated. Masjids and libraries that are hundreds of years old disappearing from the face of the earth. That is what we're talking about, or thousands of years old. That is what we are talking about. And if our so-called opinion leaders and experts refuse to recognize these stakes, they are lying to us. They are lying to us. So I've sort of reached this place, right, where I'm sort of, I will engage in ideological struggle. I have been engaging in ideological struggle, but I fundamentally question the motives of many of the people that I consider that are my colleagues in U.S. academia. I fundamentally question them.
I share the same concerns, Nina, and I think that you touched on something that helps to define the difference between yourself and those of us who have been oppressed from others, and that is the fact that we have seen and felt and experienced the contradictions. That there's a greater sense of urgency, if you will, when your own people find themselves under the gun of imperialist aggression. We don't have the luxury of these fine, abstract academic conversations. We take, well, at least I speak for myself, I take a very simple position from the time that I was young, and I was trying to understand the world. And I had already picked up by the time I was 11 years old that the US was on the side of inhumanity, that the US was, in fact, an enemy of the people. And so when I would study a historical situation that seemed complex, but I wanted to, as many young people would do, I want to find out who is right, who's wrong. I was bringing that sort of moralistic perspective. And I found a very interesting solution to this. I would just find out what side that the U.S. support. And I would then look at the other side, knowing that that was probably the correct side for myself. And about 99% of the time, that was correct. The very notion that people will not question the fact that all of these repressive states that exist on this planet never find themselves in the crosshairs of U.S. destabilization. But then those nations and those peoples, those movements that are attempting to try to do something different, that have decided that they're going to stand up for their national dignity, that they're not going to allow themselves to be manipulated and used by Western imperialism. When they find themselves under the gun, one should say, well, it must be a reason for that. But notions of the international balance of forces seems to be lost on some of our friends. So they engage in some kind of psychological paralysis. Because what happens, I think, is the comforts that they have been exposed to and have experienced has in many ways, and I know this, I try to avoid these sort of psychoanalytical kinds of exercises, but you know, the comforts of living in the West, identifying with the West. Because you could be in the global South and have the same kind of identification. It can blind you. It can cause you to objectively, inadvertently, find yourself over and over again on the side of imperialism. You might give it a sort of a left, using some left phraseology, but there are forces that every time after time will find themselves on the same side of imperialism, and that recognize that something might be wrong with that. There's something might be missing in your analysis. That every situation that has developed over the last 20 years, you find yourself on the side of Western intervention. So we have some strange things happening, and I share your frustration. But we have to continue. For those of us who have been accused of being Assadists, when I predicted everything that's now unfolded in Syria, if you allow these gangsters to destroy that state, I haven't heard any apologies from some of my friends, including friends of ours in the left forum, where in the first time in the history of the left forum, there was a walkout for a keynoter, myself, on that Sunday evening, and the same thing is happening with this conversation around Iran. What if there's so-called regime change? What does that mean in terms of the international balance of forces? What are the forces that will be placed in position to govern in that country? Will that be a benefit to the oppressed and the oppressed nations on this planet? But it seems like those kinds of considerations are not dealt with because people get off on this abstract petty bourgeois moralism.
Yes, thank you, Ajamu. Thank you both for your political clarity. It's really, really refreshing and also correct. And, really talking about the racism, the Eurocentrism, the chauvinism behind these positions as well. And I would like to just pivot, and we're going to open it up in a minute, but I have one more question for you both. And, you both are also have written extensively and analyzed the geopolitical context of declining U.S. imperialist, world order. And I'd like to talk a little bit about that before we open up and think about how that context shapes the current escalation of aggression, imperialist aggression towards Iran, and especially in the context of the so-called Monroe Doctrine, or the corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, however it's described, which was supposed to indicate a retreat more from West Asia and focus on the Americas. And of course, we know with the increasing, escalating imperialist assault in the region, not just the ongoing and escalating imperialist interventions in Haiti and in Venezuela with the hostage taking of President Maduro and first combatant Celia Flores, and of course the recent executive order in Cuba, basically cutting off fuel supplies and escalating the humanitarian crisis as a form of collective punishment and to destroy an attempt to destroy the Cuban Revolution. But at the same time, the U.S. hasn't really left, right, West Asia. So how do you understand this pivot or not pivot and the overarching context of decline of U.S. empire? Nina, do you want to start?
Yes. So I think there is truth, and I've written about this in an article that came out in over the summer on fascism, on U.S. fascism, and part 2 is coming out in the next couple of weeks, I think. There is truth to the fact that the U.S. wants to secure its interests in the Western Hemisphere. There's no question about that. And actually, one of our friends and colleagues, Tamanisha John, shared a think tank report called Securing the Core. I think the Cradle also has a report called Securing the Realm. And these reports are very consistent with actually what we're witnessing now. And it's very clear. This is not sort of an idiosyncrasy of the U.S. Empires, when they're falling, when they're ending, tend to aggressively secure their interests in what they perceive to be their core. The Germans did this the Nazis, when they pursued Lebensraum, which was the expansion in their region. The Italian fascists did it in Northern Africa and in Europe as well. That being said, the U.S. has not retreated in the way that we hope from Western Asia. It is not as present as it used to be, right? The actual number of troops has decreased. Just the overall presence in the region has definitely decreased. But it also, the commitment to maintaining Israel's power and Israel's presence in the region continues to be strong. And that's not going to just disappear without resistance. And that resistance is primarily coming out of the region. So there is a question, right, as to whether Israel can survive without the United States. It's clear to me that is not possible. But a lot of the Israelis now, if you follow the Israeli politicians, they're saying we actually need to de-link from the United States because the United States is no longer a reliable partner. I don't think Israel is going to be able to do that. I think Israel I do believe we are looking at the end of the Zionist project over the course of the next couple of decades, but that's going to come through the resistance of the people that are in the region. And what they said, what the people of the region, what the Palestinian resistance said shortly after launching Al-Aqsa Flood was that we don't view this battle, Tufan al-Aqsa, as the ultimate battle in the war of liberation, but it is one of the final battles in the war of the liberation to arrange the region to prepare our people for the final battle. And that is what Al-Aqsa Flood has done. Now, of course, at great cost, right? But that is a cost that the Palestinians have borne with dignity. So I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic that we are witnessing the end of U.S. presence in Western Asia, and with the rise of the Alliance of Sahel States, with the rise of China and Russia, the drain that the Ukraine war has caused on NATO forces and the U.S. in general, I'm quite optimistic about the Eastern Hemisphere. I do have very strong concerns about the Western Hemisphere's ability to defeat U.S. imperialism here, just because of the proximity, right? The proximity and I think it's not clear the extent to which I would love to hear this from others, Ajamu and others. It's not clear the extent to which forces in the Western Hemisphere are capable of handling the US military apparatus in a decisive way. The Western Hemisphere, the anti-imperialist forces in the Western Hemisphere have been very good models of guerrilla warfare, right? True models of guerrilla warfare. And if it comes to that level of combat, right, man-to-man combat or US military engagement, I have complete confidence in the people of Venezuela or the people of Cuba or the people of Nicaragua. But there is asymmetry with regard to, there's significant asymmetry with regard to military capability that is not as significant when it comes to Iran in the United States or China in the United States or Russia in the United States. Now, that being said, the reality is that the weaker that US imperialism becomes, right? Because US imperialism, as the forces against empire become stronger, US imperialism is becoming weaker. It's going to engage in grotesque violence in order to forestall its decline and to pillage the world. And that's what we're witnessing now. That's what we're feeling and experiencing now. But as it becomes weaker, the forces in the Western Hemisphere are going to just, by virtue of that, become stronger. But I think the Western Hemisphere is going to face a tough period in the short term. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Nina, for that.
Can I add one thing, Karina?
Sure.
So supporting Iran, and Iran in particular, right? Because Iran has proven that it is the only state in the world, well, Iran and Yemen are the two only state powers in the world that are willing to directly strike at Israel. And supporting that is important for anti-imperialists in the Western Hemisphere who want to see the US weaken so that they can become stronger. Because again, Israel is just a military garrison for the Americans, for the North Americans. So it's actually, to think strategically about the balance of powers is important for Western anti-imperialists.
Absolutely.
And Ajamu's already said this.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, the talking about the sort of shift in the balance of forces. Ajamu, did you want to add anything there?
Just briefly, I share Nina's optimism in terms of what will happen on this planet if we are successful, and that is our ability to transform ourselves and our conditions and to actually build a more civilized world. There's no question about that. But I will also say, though, that I have a slightly different assessment in terms of the sharpening contradictions and what that might mean for regional struggles. You raised the question about a pivot, and we all know the famous so-called pivot to Asia under the Obama administration, which was, in fact, a pivot or the beginning of a pivot. But I would argue that part of what we see in terms of U.S. policy, in particular under the Trump administration, in its most aggressive form, is a continuation of that pivot, but with the concentration being in Western Asia. And that is the objective, of course, with the pivot was to do what? To attempt to try to contain and isolate China. I think that part of that strategy from the Trump forces was to become more aggressive in West Asia in order to impose itself and its ability to control the energy sources of West Asia. Objectively, look at what we have. We have Iraq basically under the control of the U.S. And they can't even control the revenue generated by the sale of the oil. You have them, the U.S. now moving to try to, and they've already imposed draconian sanctions on Iran, even though there's still trade that takes place. But that could be completed if they were able to effect regime change in Iran. They unleashed uh, their uh, their military force in West Asia through Israel, as they have now altered the balance of forces in a very fundamental way in West Asia with the successes that they've been able to experience in Syria, in southern Lebanon. And so they've been rolling quite interesting. Now, there is, in terms of state to state military confrontations, the it would be it's a different kind of reality there in terms of confrontations versus in the West. Now, I believe that the key to the defeat of U.S. and Western imperialism, in fact, resides in the Western Hemisphere. You know, in terms of state to state military confrontations, that's not going to happen. Is that it really doesn't need to happen in that way. But the political culture in this hemisphere, as I sit here in Cali, Colombia, its history of opposition, its history of organization, the depth of the experimentations that have taken place that resulted, for example, in the so-called pink tide. I hate that title or that framing, but uh, the lessons learned from that. You know, um, I see the U.S. state making profound mistakes in attempting to try to successfully isolate Cuba, in Venezuela. We know that they are posed to strike against Nicaragua, but the reaction from the masses here in this region is of defiance. It is of a greater commitment to more concentrated organization. And if the enemy is drawn into conflicts on the ground, which I think they're going to try to avoid, I think that the shift of power, the balance of power would be definitely to our advantage. So, these are complex situations that we can't always prefigure what might happen. But one thing we can be assured of is that in the desperate attempt on the part of these forces to try to maintain some remnants of their global hegemony, they are making fundamental mistakes. They're opening up spaces for us to advance our forces. We used to say within the context of the Black is Back coalition that we must go on the offensive, that we must turn imperialist wars into wars against imperialism. And that is, in fact, developing. And we've seen the consequences of that. So, I have great optimism that the next period will be tough because we are seeing the consolidation of fascism, both within national contexts and globally. But my optimism is such that we are a majority, and I think that as a consequence of that and the clarity that we're going to arrive at based on these experiences we're having right now, I think it's almost inevitable that after a few years, 'cause I don't see 20 years, I see because I think this is unsustainable. I think that whatever's going to happen is going to explode over the next few years.
Can I jump in, Karina? Because I want to talk about Lebanon and actually Iraq for a minute. So in Iraq, the parliamentary elections just occurred, and the resistance factions. It was a decisive victory for the resistance factions, Hashd Shabi and the other resistance factions. And in Lebanon, it is true that south of the Litani, Israel likes to say that it occupies south of the Litani. It does not. It occupies just the security belt, which is a tiny, tiny area. And the south of the Litani is not, in fact, demilitarized. Hezbollah is still there. Hezbollah has said that it is now recovered. And so the strength of the resistance in the region is really important to consider, especially in light of the fact that, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, we were looking at the destruction of Iraq, right? And the destruction of Afghanistan. And I think, Ajamu, I agree with you about the pivot to China, but I think they've been trying to pivot for many, many years, and it's not going so well because, the US, it takes one step forward, but China takes 3 or 4 steps forward, and Iran takes 3 or 4 steps forward. And that's why I think this pivot has taken so long and is unsuccessful and has turned into tariff wars and trade wars, et cetera, which even then China is not affected in the way that the US wants. Sanctions against Russia, which backfired. So I think they are still trying to pivot, and they're going to continue to try to pivot, but they're also realizing the pivot is failing, and they're trying to, they're also going for Plan B.
Absolutely, absolutely. And also, of course, the increased strategic, military, economic cooperation between states like China, Iran, Russia, for example. Think about the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the de-dollarization that's happening as part of the impact of sanctions and the resistance to sanctions. So, I just want to say that, thank you both for that, again, for such clarity. And I share your revolutionary optimism at the same time, acknowledging, of course, the cost, the human dimension as well, which you both have touched on. In the last maybe 15, 20 minutes, I have a couple of questions, and you all can choose which ones to address or not. And I think there might be more coming in. I just want to thank comrades Henry and Bahman for sending these over. These are taken from the Q&A chat. So the first one is, how do we engage in workers' struggles here when the leadership refuses to discuss any global issues like the genocide in Palestine or the attacks on Venezuela, Cuba, Iran? Maybe I would just add to that, there has been some movement, I think, especially in the big trade unions. Certainly on Venezuela, there were 11 unions that put out resolutions and statements following the hostage taking and the direct attack on Venezuelan soil, including the International Trade Union Congress and the AFL-CIO, which are historically have been very aligned with U.S. imperialism. And I think there's been some movement on Palestine and Cuba as well, but Iran, it seems like heavy lift. I haven't seen any unions come out with statements or do webinars or resolutions. So yeah, maybe addressing, if you feel like it, addressing that question. Another question is, how do we oppose the fragmentation in the U.S.? What forces do we work with? And I think that goes back to a point maybe that Ajamu raised in the first part of his remarks. Third, name some forms of resistance in the U.S. How do we raise consciousness in our children so that they don't drown in the violent ocean of American KKK capitalism and empire? And then lastly, or there might be one more coming through, but what could be done to form a global forum for true social justice advocates? And then how can we marshal this disaffection, especially given Trump's gift, quote unquote, of cruel governance that is crushing support for the US state? So I guess these are all sort of organizing questions about how the various social forces in the belly of the beast and, the building what it would take to really build a solid anti-imperialist movement in solidarity with Iran. Who'd like to go first?
Well, I take a stab at that first question because I think it's kind of connected to all the other ones too. We talked about this battle. This was why I framed it as sort of a Gramscian war of position, ideological war of position. And it's interesting that this term of imperialism is now beginning to be utilized in circles that just a few months ago we didn't see that term being utilized by certain individuals, organizations, legislators, unions. Now, what's interesting about that to me is this, that part of why the term is being used is because of its sort of anti-Trumpian character. Okay. But what is going to be valuable to us is for us to utilize that and give it real substance, give the term real meaning, expand it beyond this focus on Trump, and help people to understand that the Trumpian agenda and the forces that Trump represents are the forces of various sectors of the capitalist class, and that there is bipartisan consensus on most of what's being advanced, that the difference basically is tactical as opposed to the objective agenda. But it allows us to engage those forces that are grappling with these kinds of questions. And we say those forces, meaning those forces that are organizing, attempting to try to address these issues and these contradictions, the activists, if you will. It allows us to engage those forces and helping to elevate their understanding of what needs to be done. So it's going to provide us an opportunity in the same way that when we had the Sanctions forces that for a moment had introduced and was kind of re-legitimizing, if you will, or legitimizing really for the first time in mainstream discourse, the term socialism. And many people incorrectly condemn the Sanders definitions of socialism as opposed to understanding, as organizers did, that you build off of that. Of course, those definitions were limited. Your responsibility as an organizer is to use that foundation and to expand it. Use the opportunity that's been given to you. But we talk about some of the contradictions of the left in terms of its Eurocentrism and all of that. But we have other contradictions also too, which is the 50-year counter-revolutionary process in the U.S. has been successful in really providing real impediments to the continuity of our struggles in the U.S. The intergenerational conveyance of experiences and understanding, so that we have a very, very immature and somewhat disorganized left that tends to posture instead of engaging the enemy. And so, we say, let's go ahead and get past this and deal with these things in a way that's going to move our resistance forward here in this country.
Excellent. Thank you, Ajamu. Nina, would you like to?
Yeah, and I was just like skimming through the questions, and somebody said, "Why is Nina using infamous about China?" And that was a mistake. I meant to say famously, not infamously. So my apologies. So the thing is about, and this is sort of taking the lead from what Ajamu just said about, deepening our understanding of imperialism. The thing about empires is that they all fall. They can't last. There isn't a single empire in world history that has lasted more than some hundreds of years, and this one is going to fall too. So this idea of sort of an eternally naturalized United States, right, that's always going to exist in its current form is actually hard to believe, because geographically speaking, this project is quite vast. It's actually very, very vast. Culturally, there's a lot of differences internally. Politically, as we see, there are lots of differences. We're experiencing that now. Economically, there's lots of difference. So it's very hard to hold imperialist projects together just geographically. And this is, at the end of the day, a continental empire from sea to shining sea. And so if that is the objective reality of imperialism, then there are opportunities there, right? because there are still live and vibrant land disputes with the indigenous nations here. There are land disputes with Black people here, and disputes about wealth redistribution and reparations. And so I'm hopeful that as the empire falls, right, as it just sort of begins to fall apart at the seams, the peoples here that really built this land, and specifically Black people and indigenous people, will organize to get what they deserve. And if you look at like sort of what indigenous nations are doing right now, they've made a lot of headway over the last couple of decades, a lot. And the same can be said of the analysis and the level of political struggle coming out of the Black community, I think. I know that we all have critiques and all that, but I'm actually quite hopeful on that front as well. And if for no other reason, it's because this thing is falling. This thing is falling. And so, you know, we will suffer in the interim. We will all suffer in the interim. But we're looking at a monumental transition in terms of world history, the end of the largest empire in world history, the end of the European and white control of the world. That is happening. And it's an incredible opportunity.
I think you're absolutely right. The nightmare that began in 1492 is rapidly coming to a close. But we are going to have to wrap it up all the way. That basically, it's why there are internal contradictions. Those contradictions have to be sharpened. We've got to engage in more intense struggle. Identifying those forces that we have to organize. One of the questions was, identifying what forces that needed to be organized and brought into organized resistance. And of course, for those of us who are part of the African American or African liberation process, working primarily in the U.S., but globally, of course, what has framed our work is the objective fact that we are both a colonized people and a people who have been subjected to super exploitation from this colonial capitalist system. And so therefore for us, what we want is the same as what everybody wants. And we want to, and that is to basically change the system, to transform the system, to eliminate this colonial capitalist system. And we're not going to settle for anything less. We have a revolutionary objective. We are building a revolutionary process, and we're doing that in conjunction with the revolutionary forces represented by various indigenous people in this country, by the people who find themselves in this country who are so-called Latinos, who understand what needs to be done, by unifying our forces with the Puerto Rican independence movement, with all of the peoples and working class elements that recognize that we're not going to be able to live in peace. We're not going to be able to have any kind of prosperity. We're not going to be able to survive unless we rise up and confront this historical moment by defeating this consolidating fascist system. So, we're quite clear about what needs to be done. And we want to take advantage of the opportunities that the enemy will give us. For example, one of the campaigns that I think people have heard about that we need to continue to look at, because we have a struggle that has to take place on multiple fronts, is how do we avoid this normalization of genocide, of global fascism led by the U.S., with the U.S. being given an opportunity to host the World Cup this year and in 2028, the Olympics. We can't allow that to happen. The U.S. cannot be allowed to engage in a racist genocide because it is the U.S., to engage in the kind of gangsterism it engaged in Venezuela, the kind of lawlessness that's resulting in this siege of Cuba. And then we just pretend like everything is fine and allow these criminals to host the World Cup. Oh, no, 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 no. We have to delegitimize this process. We can't allow that to happen. So we've got to look at how we raise the issue of this World Cup. We said we've got to boycott the U.S. the same way we talk about boycotting the fascists in so-called Israel. Connect them because they are connected. Both of these settler colonial enemy projects. So we want people to engage in this campaign. Understand why it's not going to result in a revolutionary transformation tomorrow is part of that war of position we talked about earlier. The delegitimizing whatever legitimation they still have, delegitimizing these criminals. So we have campaigns we can use and we can exploit when the enemy provides us these kinds of opportunities. And this attempt to try to host a World Cup this year is a marvelous opportunity to raise all of these issues and all of these contradictions.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you both. I mean, I think the points that you've raised just about the social forces here, building on the hundreds of years of resistance from indigenous nations, from Black liberation struggle to the national liberation struggles of Puerto Rico and everyone else impacted by U.S. imperialism, continuing on those legacies. And, oops, sorry about that. But contending also, as you said, Ajamu, with the counter-revolutionary forces here from the state, the ideological level, the material level, the carceral police state, the ICE fascist raids. Ultimately, as you both stated, the momentum is there and it's building, and U.S. empire will fall. And these are the forces that are aligned here inside the belly of the beast to accelerate that process and accelerate those contradictions and build something new. So I really appreciate that. Again, thank you both just for your incisive, really brilliant analysis, not just of the current conjuncture and the context of U.S. imperialism and Iranian resistance, but also thinking about how we could really build an anti-imperialist resistance in this country and to fight back against the war on Iran and, the U.S. imperialism more broadly. And so please, I urge everyone to continue, if you're not already following the work of the various organizations that both Ajamu and Nina represent, but also, of course, of the U.S. Peace Council. We have a statement that just came out on Cuba, and we have one on Iran and Venezuela as well. Continue to organize, mobilize, as Black Alliance for Peace always says, no compromise, no retreat, and looking forward to connecting again soon. Thank you so much, comrades, and thank you to everyone in the audience. We had close to 200 people who registered, and we had over 150 who were here, and most people stayed on because this is just such gripping analysis, and really, really powerful work from both of you. So thanks again.